To really explain why the Renaissance Center moves from Florence to Rome, one thing we really have to consider is a man named Girolamo Savonarola. This might be a name you've even heard of before. Savonarola came to Florence in about the 1480s. And when he was there, he earned a reputation for learning and austerity, like he was very strict, and also for very strong faith. He was a popular preacher, preached a lot of like hellfire and damnation to the people. And one of his popular themes was that he was convinced the classical philosophies of the Renaissance were heresy and that God was going to like punish anyone who adhered to them and listened to them and supported them. So he was a really strong opponent of the humanism of the Renaissance. But he becomes incredibly popular, like super popular. His crowds that would come to listen to him preach grew and grew over time. And eventually he could fill up the Duomo in Florence. And it was packed to come in and listen to hear. People wanted to come in and listen to hear him. So when the French invaded invaded Italy in 1494, many people in Florence really thought that this was the fulfillment of some of the prophecies of Savonarola. And so when the Medici are kicked out very shortly after that, also in 1494, this really sets up Savonarola to be in a position to take control. And he does. He reinstitutes a Republican government once again in Florence, which had kind of fizzled out under the Medici. And during this time, he replaced a lot of the Florentine carnivals with religious festivals. And he also got like the little orphans and the street urchins to kind of be a little bit of a Gestapo force for him. And he would have them go out and come back and report about any kind of like luxury goods and pastimes and any sort of like heretical ideas or events that were circulating out in the city. So one really good example of how austere he'd become and how much he luxury objects and classical philosophies is the bonfire of the vanities. And this is something that you may have heard of before. It happens in 1497 on Mardi Gras, which is kind of like the last day before Lent in the Catholic tradition. So it's the last day before they enter into a period of kind of fasting and self-control, and they kind of reject a lot of pleasurable activities and foods. So he encouraged everyone to come to this bonfire and to burn what he called vanities, things that were distracting them from their faith and distracting them from their Catholic belief. Things like gaming tables, cards, books, costumes, like really beautiful kinds of dresses and so on that were really elaborate. And along with that, any kind of ornamentation that was elaborate, carnival masks, and of course, even statues and paintings. And even Botticelli, that we looked at in the last module, he even burns one of his own paintings. So as time goes on, and Savonarola is really gaining a lot of ground in Florence, and a lot of people are listening to what he has to say. Unfortunately, Savonarola makes some really powerful enemies. One of those is the Borgia family, and the Pope at the time is actually a member of this family, and he makes enemies of them over a number of political issues, and it comes back to haunt him. He is going to eventually be executed in 1498 for heresy. So it's important to remember a couple of different things about Savonarola. First is that he is a really strong critic of the corruption within the Catholic Church. He's calling for reform, and he's just part of the many calls for change that we see in the years leading up to the official beginning of the Protestant Reformation, which is just around the corner in 1517. But the other thing, and the reason that we're talking about him now, and it's very important for you to realize here, is that you have to kind of think about how Florence would have changed during this time period when Savonarola was so powerful. Florence had been alive with classical thoughts like humanism and Neoplatonism, and for artists and intellectuals, this was a great place and a great environment for them to kind of flourish. We have to also remember that Florence had been teeming, just stocked full of middle-class patrons who wanted to purchase Renaissance art. They wanted to buy art with classical ideas and use that as a status symbol. But under Savonarola's spell, that all changed, right? Opinions toward art itself changed. Savonarola preached against it as vanity. Opinions towards classicism and ideas like humanism and Neoplatonism, that was even worse, right? Those were heresy, according to Savonarola. So now, think about what this means for someone who is an artist who'd been working and selling in Florence, especially if they were an artist that was using this new Renaissance classicism. Their market took a sharp downturn, right? And especially once the Medici are kicked out, and that's only temporary. They'll come back into power in Florence in a few years. But when they leave the city, that's a huge chunk of patronage that's gone right there. The rest of the people that are there, many of them are adherents or influenced by Savonarola. So there's just very few commissions, very few opportunities in Florence at this time. So at the same time, the Catholic Church, which is centered in Rome, is really starting to kick up the number of commissions of art and architecture that they are interested in doing. And they're really wanting to try and bolster up their reputation. They want everyone to be visually impressed with their dominance and their power. And they want to send out these messages as a way to argue against some of the critics that were speaking out against the Catholic Church at this point in time. So artists who had been in Florence underneath Savonarola and this time period that we're talking about right before the High Renaissance, many of those artists pick up and they leave. And a great place for them to go is Rome, where the Catholic Church is waiting to just use them and create incredible amounts of art and architecture in the High Renaissance.